you will be visible to attendees when asking your question. If you're participating through phone audio, you can offer questions via the chat room only. Again, Annie will be pulling questions from the chat room as available. And finally, again, for those of you who are new to Zoom, there are different options for you in terms of what you're viewing, and you may want to choose the active speaker option, again, on your control panel. It should be up on the right-hand side. And that way you see only the speaker versus everybody else, or you can also pick gallery view as well. So for those of you who are new to MassEcon, we encourage you to visit our website, massecon.com, to learn more about us. And it's important to note also at this time that this presentation will be available at the website, massecon.com. So if you go to that later today, you'll be able to see at our COVID-19 Resource Center the link to this presentation, so you can take a look at it subsequently. So back to the agenda, we will have our three panelists make presentations in approximately 30 minutes time, the initial 30 minutes of this event. Then we have reserved the rest of the time, 25 minutes or so, for key questions and answers. And again, you should all be in muted mode, and we ask you to raise hand using that control option, and always be ready to ask your question when you're called upon during that section. And finally, after the Q&A period, we'll just share some information about some additional resources that you can tap into. So on to our panel, Reopening Commercial Operations. We have three terrific panelists with us today, and this is the order in which they will be presenting. Emily Klein, followed by Sean Carroll, and Paul Bauer. So Emily Klein is the Director of Workplace Strategy and Associate Principal at the global design firm Perkins & Will. Her diversified career has been at the intersection of change management, workplace strategy, and organizational development. Emily collaborates with clients across sectors to design workplace initiatives and workspaces, building tailored solutions that optimize employee experience while helping navigate complex change. Over the past month, Emily has been part of a firm-wide effort at Perkins & Will to develop an in-depth roadmap for return with action steps. And we'll be sharing more about safety and health employee considerations as we begin phased return to workplaces. Thank you for joining us, Emily. Next, the following speaker would be Sean Carroll. Sean is director at CBRE with over 20 years at the firm. He has been general manager of Fan Pier in the Seaport since 2011 and is responsible for overseeing over 3 million square feet of space in Massachusetts. Sean was selected in this fateful year to serve as president of BOMA, Boston, the Building Owners and Managers Association. Sean is a veteran of the United States Navy, and we thank you, Sean, for your service. Our last presenter will be Paul Bauer. Paul is a partner with the Massachusetts law firm Bowditch, where he is a practice area leader, real estate, finance, and corporate. Paul represents businesses, individuals, and institutions throughout Massachusetts in sophisticated transactions with an emphasis on large real estate projects and challenging commercial law issues. Paul advises developers, mortgage lenders, tenants, property owners across various industry sectors in complex development, acquisition, financing, business planning, and leasing transactions. And so we look forward to hearing from each of these speakers, each bringing a slightly different perspective to the issues associated with reopening workplaces. And so we're going to start with Emily Klein with her perspective, bringing it this really focusing on the employer considerations and providing for employee safety in Restart. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Pete. As you mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you about a lot of these employee considerations that's top of mind for everybody in phase return to our offices. As Pete mentioned, at Perkins and Will, we have developed, next slide please, a firm-wide roadmap for return, which is really a holistic and integrated set of actions and a way forward that we have been using across all of our studios to think about the next phase of coming back into offices and in helping our clients. And as you can see here, this is the abbreviated version, but it really goes into kind of a deep dive. Everything that we're doing is grounded in public health guidance as we think about the considerations of a safe and healthy and resilient return to the office. Next slide. So what you see in front of you is the World Health Organization phases of a pandemic. And one of the reasons why we are using this slide is to contextualize where we're all at right now, because we know that we're in the response phase, right? We have had workplace restrictions and we're moving towards that transition phase. All of us are paying close attention to public health guidance. We're paying close attention to Mayor Walsh and Governor Baker and some of that encouraging news that's coming out this week with looking at ICU hospitalizations and that downward trend trajectory. We hope that continues. We're thinking about, employers and all of us towards that May 18th date and beyond. And we know that we need to, establish reasonable protection in the workplace to ensure that individual level of comfort going back into returning. One thing just to share, and we all know this, that we may be faced with multiple cycles of infectious outbreaks, so we have to consider the impact of what that means. And the data showed us maybe we might be facing something like that downstream. Things are evolving daily, as we all know, and we're just having to pivot and adjust accordingly. Next. So what you see here is our framework. This has been the framework for how we are returning to work and the roadmap. And the path back includes where we work, how we operate, communications, behaviors through each phase. We have organized this around 3 categories, from work location to operations and behaviors and messages. All of us are thinking about what does it mean to figure out physical distancing and maximum seat capacity and planning the phased returns, knowing that we're also going to have more remote workers that are out initially still. We're having to rethink our protocols. What does that mean, for physical distancing? How does that show up in all of our floor plates in the buildings that we're in? PPE, food and beverage, visitors and deliveries, maintenance protocols. There is so much in terms of really rethinking this during this transition phase, this important transition phase of planning and going back into offices. We have to consider, and of course, a lot of this is underscored by the kind of behaviors and messages we need to think about. New transition protocols, in-office etiquette. How do we continue to support our remote workers going forward? All of these things is part of the roadmap and wraps around all of our employee considerations. Next. So following the question of when to return is how to return, right? So everything that we're doing, as I mentioned, is grounded in safety and health. These are our only priorities for establishing office capacity, the capacity that we need to look at, planning return, looking at new office protocols. What does that mean for all of us? How long will they need to be in effect? And reinforcing those new behaviors. This is very much like a change management exercise. Of course, planning for, preparing for, managing, and reinforcing change. And that takes time for employees to adjust to these new protocols. We have to account for that. Next. What office design and protocols can't address every hazard. We all know this. When returning to work, when we leave homes, there are going to be risks, right? There are things that we have to consider. My risk threshold may be very different than your risk threshold. What does it mean to feel safe or safe enough to leave our houses and get back into the office? There are many, many commute considerations, and it's really interesting to think about that here in the Boston metropolitan region, how we've been dealing with transportation issues, in Cambridge and in Boston and beyond. There's a lot to think about in terms of the subway, getting back onto the T, getting back onto buses with reduced schedules, and who comes back and when. And really important to think about. Maybe there'll be more cyclists that we'll see coming back, at least in this transition phase. There's a lot of things to consider in terms of building entry. Paths will converge, high touch surfaces we need to think about, elevators and stairs, and more. And I know Sean and Paul are going to be talking about that. So even if the office is ready, are employees ready? Employees are not going to have the same comfort level, as we all know. We have a lot of different situations that we're confronting, right? Childcare. We know, like myself, we have students who are at home in remote learning situations until the end of June. We're waiting to hear about what summer camp guidance is going to be. Some people, employees, may have increased risk due to health conditions. What we've been sharing is that you want to set a cadence for asking for employees to return in a volunteer basis, that it's okay if they have a lot of these other considerations. This is not normal remote work under these circumstances. Using a survey is going to be really helpful to gauge interest and concerns. We're sharing with all of our clients and organizations need to consider that. That's going to be very helpful. Next slide. How many people could come back into the office safely is a lot of what we're thinking about and helping our clients around at Perkins and Will. There are currently no guidelines on how to, think about how many people come back in, other than the general distancing guidelines around 6 feet separation. So you see here on the left-hand side, we evaluate the number of workstations and collaboration seats that can be occupied simultaneously to come up with what is the maximum seat capacity. And one of the things we're sharing is that you want to establish maximum capacity based on guidelines for each floor plate to ensure that shared spaces, amenity spaces, restrooms, pantries, cafes, meeting spaces are not overwhelmed. On the right, you see what this looks like. We do a lot of this work with clients on the physical distancing analysis diagrams right now. We're doing this across a lot of practice areas. But if you look at the workstations, enclosed rooms, and shared amenity spaces, you see where it identifies workspaces that can be occupied, those that cannot be. Next slide. So how many people should come back in the office? We're all thinking about this. It's top of mind for all the employers, thinking about employees. Once you have that maximum capacity per floor identified, you want to set your initial targets, right? You want to be conservative to start. We know that there are more risks than benefits when maximizing capacity, and we're going to really be learning. So you're going to adjust your space and protocols as we move forward from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and beyond. What we're finding, a lot of us have been talking about this, that probably expect around 20 to 40% of your maximum capacity is going to come in phase 1. You're going to test those new measures before increasing the population. You might need to consider, team A and team B. Some teams come in on Monday and Thursdays. Others come in on, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. You might be exploring shift working, what that looks like. What we do know from CDC is that the guidance is to move from unassigned space to assigned space, that employees should not be sharing their workstations or their equipment. That has a lot of impact on co-working spaces, open office workspaces, and you need to understand that, there may be more volunteers who come in who want to get out of their home offices right away, and there may not enough, and that what we're guiding our clients around and what we're doing is creating a transparent decision process to determine who comes back in. Next. So as I just mentioned, we're looking at sort of alternating days, working in shifts. What could that possibly look like? And the assigned seating. And that's, if you previously had an unassigned or an agile seating strategy, you might want to consider putting that on hold till after this transition phase. It's going to be really interesting to do that going forward. Next slide. This is a really good opportunity to evaluate your remote work program also. Remote working has become a way of life. We all had to pivot very rapidly in March into remote site offices. It's not remote work under normal circumstances. I have spent years working with companies to help them around remote work. How do you establish mobility as part of your culture to be able to work from anywhere? Right now, being able to use some surveys to determine quality of experience and interest in remote working is going to help you identify the data around who's coming into the office first, who can be part of the remote work arrangements for a longer period of time, and we know there's going to be a lot more hybrid teams of remote workers and in-office workers. Also, identify where remote working has been most effective, and we find that virtual technologies often impact workflows and communications. Efficiencies can be gained. This could also help you identify who might be able to still stay out of the office beyond just phase one. So that's important. And of course, identifying what remains challenging from that human lens. Digital isolation can come into play when we're in remote site offices, issues of parity. We have to look at process, technology, cultural perspectives. So one-on-one conversations we're encouraging our clients to think about. We encourage employers to think about that as well. Survey data, focus group, all of this information is going to yield the data that you need to make the right decisions about phasing back in. Next slide. Many operations considerations are before all of us. We need to think and rethink in this transition phase, how do we provide a safe workplace? And the way I'm talking a lot about this is like envision a day in the life. What does it mean when an employee lands out of the elevator into your reception and lobby area? Are we going to have temperature testing for everyone? There's been so much conversation about testing. We're going to have contact tracing? Are we going to have antibody testing? What is that going to look like? It's going to evolve over time. Protective equipment and supplies, you might want to create a return to work kit. Our Shanghai office, when they were going back to office at Perkins and Will, supplied masks, hand sanitizers, and even vitamin C. There are a lot of things to consider in positioning around your office with protective equipment and supplies. Food and beverage services, you may want to think about assigning lunch times. I know other organizations are supplying brown bag lunches so that individual employees will be eating lunch at their workstation and not moving around. Might want to consider recyclable, compostable, one-use products during transition phase. There are just so many things we have to reconsider with the high-touch appliances that are in offices. And then when it comes to guests, right, limiting outside delivery personnel to reception areas when they come in, placing temporary staging areas near freight elevators, cleaning equipment used to process incoming packages. There are so many new sort of maintenance protocols for cleaning around disinfecting high-touch surfaces, increasing that frequency of regular maintenance. And how are we going to communicate all this, right, to employees and set that expectations of knowing what's going to be expected of them coming into the building? Really important. Next slide. And that really underscores this, right? Our words matter. Everything that we're sharing with our employees. It feels like communications have been nonstop since we've all had to kind of live in this COVID-19 changed world that we're in. We know that going back in is not going to exactly look like what it was when we left. And we want to be able to create communication tools that include printed signs and reminders. For employees, we want instructions on new processes and procedures. These are things that we have been developing in our roadmap for return. There is guidance on health and safety in the office. You can download some of these from the public health organizations to use in your offices. And that this is a time also to create additional support for those who are working in distributed teams. Messages of inspiration, positivity, of course, go a long way because we are all in this together. We're all figuring this out together. It's evolving on a daily basis. Next slide. Which kind of leads me to the last thing I wanted to share. And there are a lot of design considerations, actually, that are very interestingly kind of coming up and surfacing now about the future. What our workplace experience is going to look like for all of us going forward. I'm really fascinated in these kinds of conversations, thinking about behaviors. Are we going to go back to our same behaviors and workplace practices once we have more therapeutics and a vaccination that is widespread available to everybody? It's a question, along with the trends in square feet per person. Square foot, that's changed over the years. As we all know, it's been reduced. Is it now going to increase? How do we design for greater material health while implementing additional cleaning strategies? Really important question. Are companies going to decide to lease less space? Are they going to maintain a focus? Are our employers going to maintain this focus on de-densifying the spaces post COVID-19? And then everything that's in the past week that I've been hearing all of us talking about is this optimization of air filtration systems inside buildings. How do we provide cleaner air? Because I think there's been such a focus on healthy, well-building, building materials. We know that we have to consider relooking at HVAC systems and maybe even portable air filters, HEPA filters that will come in during this transition phase. I know Sean is going to be speaking a little bit about this, as well as Paul. So with that, I'm going to turn this back to you, Pete.
Great. Thank you very much, Emily. There's a lot to think about there, and that's terrific information. In transitioning to Sean Carroll, now we're going to get a slightly different perspective, really that of the property manager, owner, and how they can advise tenants in terms of returning and prepare facilities for the return to the workplace. So Sean, I will turn it over to you.
All right, Peter, thank you very much. And we can go to the next slide. But as Peter alluded to earlier, my name is Sean Carroll. I have the good fortune of being the 2020 BOMA Boston president. I'm not sure what I did to deserve this, but I remarked in yesterday's board meeting, which had prior presidents invited to it, that I believe some of their issues of their years were things like recycling and hard topics like, do we change the venue of the annual golf tournament? So how I got stuck on a year with COVID-19, I'm not sure. So some housekeeping items that my PowerPoint slides aren't as cosmetically and fundamentally as wonderful as Emily's were. Mine are more designed because those are some fantastic slides, substantively and cosmetically. Mine are to try to keep me on track so that we're not here till 3 p.m. So, you know, as BOMA Boston president, we came out of the gates in mid-February by putting a task force together that meets by Zoom weekly with landlords, property managers, and other service providers that have, you know, really have tried to collaborate for the best interests of the greater good and the health and welfare of our clients, of our tenants, of our occupants, of our properties here in Massachusetts. And it's been a wonderful collaboration where I believe everyone has been, you know, truly engaged in the topic and best practices, lessons learned, experiences, and what people are learning and hearing as we've gone through this crisis. You know, what we're dealing with right now, our property managers and landlords really trying to get a full understanding of the practical issues in regards to, you know, full tenant reentry for occupying the properties. The buildings, most buildings have been open during this entire experience for essential workers, essential businesses, and to keep the buildings operational and clean and safe for those people who have had to work over the past 2 months. So what managers and clients are doing at this time is they're really taking a building by building approach, client by client, and working on their properties on a case by case basis, because no two buildings, no two properties are alike. There is a large differential between suburban office properties and urban properties. There are pros and cons to both in regards to transportation services that are utilized to get to work, you know, whether buildings have multiple entrance ways or single entrance ways. And so really on a case by case, building by building basis, managers are working with their clients to develop a plan to provide comfort and peace of mind to tenant occupants as they return to work, some of who have not returned to work in months at this point. So, you know, there's a lot of looking at what other states have done. BOMA Boston has been forwarding along through its membership, restarting business operations from other states to take a look at and a glimpse at what may be before us when the Governor's Council finalizes their plans and or the Mayor of Boston implements his higher standards perhaps for reentry and reoccupying non-essential office space in the city of Boston. So as we continue to go through the process over the next couple of weeks, as we lead up to the 18th, when at this time it appears we may learn more from state and local officials unless something changes before that, which is a byproduct of all of our planning, is the need to be flexible and the need to be able to pivot on a dime if things should change, both positively and or negatively, and be able to make those accommodations. So, you know, right now there's a lot of, you know, managing of people's expectations. You know, people are harder to work upon than, say, machinery and other types of products there. When you're working with people, I know there'll be a huge emphasis on continuing best practices for social distancing and controlling the egress of people getting to and from the property, getting in the property. So there'll be properties that will have dedicated entrance ways and dedicated exit ways to and from the building. There'll be stanchions and areas that might normally not have barriers placed upon to try to get people to move in one particular direction to limit the exposure from one person to another. If you look at states similar to the state of Ohio and their recommendations, and yet also their mandates for reentry and restarting the economy, there are PPE requirements for personnel who are going to be working that are part of the phase 1 reentry process. In the initial onset of this experience, there was a resistance towards PPE requirements, and a lot of it was mostly, scarcity of availability of products, and some of it was even kind of cosmetic of not wanting to go into a particular building and see people wearing gloves and masks and believe that there's a negative situation at hand. That has evolved over the last 2 months, and now you can pretty much forecast that PPE requirements are going to be a large standard of the initial reentry process, and looking towards personal accountability. The individual's role in this, the employee, is going to be greatly emphasized throughout the entire communication plan of reentry, we believe, if we look towards other states in kind of the process of even right now within our own state and for items for areas that have opened. So that'll help in a lot of ways in regards to commuting best practices, because the individual is going to need to account for his or herself from when they leave work from their home to when they return from work from their home. So, the emphasis, I think you will continue to see communication on best practices recommended by state and local officials and the CDC as we continue to go into the future. Scarcity of supplies I put on here as an item for tenants to take under their consideration. The landlords are doing their best, and their vendors and contractors did their best to obtain certain, products and supplies in advance as this issue started to present itself. But for the tenants and the occupants of their own premises, tenants should, if they haven't already, be looking to purchase, PPE for their personnel, other types of products such as Purell. Purell has been a bit, a lot of companies got out in front of it months ago and have stockpiled some of it for their common areas, entranceways to the buildings, lobbies, common floor plates, et cetera, et cetera. However, in non-secured areas, that item has been, a little bit more kind of volatile to being subject to theft and stuff of that nature. So getting disinfectants also from the onset of the virus presenting itself, there was a lot of additional cleaning that was put in place. And I think will continue to still need to be in place. A lot of the large operators still maintain a significant good share of disinfecting cleaning, but there was a protocol prior to the stay from home advisory for doing enhanced disinfecting on a nightly basis for some tenants, and that has led to a depletion of availability for some of those products. So tenant premises cleaning will be a concern moving forward, and then also an emphasis on the individual, we believe too, to keep his or her workstation cleaned and disinfected when it comes to their telephone and their keyboards and their actual desk itself, knowing that the cleaning specs are not normally inclusive of that type of detail. So, a lot of my items, and I will be similar to Emily's presentation because it was so wonderfully put together. So I'll try not to labor upon those items, but we too have, prepared for staggered hours in our flexible working conditions from what we've heard from our own employer and from employers at a lot of our large office buildings is, there will be, kind of a get in, get out type of philosophy if an individual truly does not need to work in the building. So you're hearing a lot about what would have been referred to as like essential attendance over the next few months as part of a phase 1 occupancy. And we've heard everything from some companies looking to eagerly await to return once the governor and mayor allows them to already weeks ago informing landlords that they were not going to be returning until June, after the 4th of July, to potentially the end of the summer, due to the fact that the summer schedule is kind of a flexible period in the Northeast anyways. So taking advantage of this kind of the summertime slowdown, where almost every day will look like, I refer to as like summertime Fridays. So that could be like the new norm as we move forward. And there have been some large operators who are, worried that there's not a vaccine or a significant treatment in place, that have set the table that they may not truly return until there is such, which may be towards the end of through the calendar year or beyond, to some great capacity. So we've heard a lot, similar to Emily's presentation, about a 25 or less occupancy. Those items, again, those issues could be addressed as mandates by the state of Massachusetts and the city when those plans are put in place. And I think you're going to see a lot of split staffing of the management office operations. A great concern of us in third-party commercial real estate management is to make sure that no one building staff, including the administrative staff and maintenance staff, don't all contract the virus simultaneously, whereas an entire office building loses its core personnel. So you'll see some cross training on various buildings regionally within different areas, and you'll see most likely continued practices which were put in place really weeks ago, just prior to the work from home advisory. Where you'll have staffs divided up themselves, splitting either every other day or weekly or something like that to kind of keep a team together for their knowledge of a particular property. So next, thank you. So signage, I'll try to move quickly. I told you I didn't want you to be till 3 p.m. So signage will be a big, huge issue of the day. You're going to see a lot more signage. Some landlords and some tenants have always hated to have signage pollution in their buildings and in their beautiful lobbies and entranceways, but you're going to see signage for communication purposes all over the place. And that will be signage in regards to egress, dedicated entrances and exits. You're going to see wellness signage, with recommendations, signage right out of the gates that if you are not feeling well, if you've been, if you have someone in your family not feeling well, just really trying to proactively have some people take a second look as to really should they be working, which has contradicted so many things over the course of time, where you have, your good, solid employees, your workhorses who have just produced so much for you, or just, they're dedicated, they're putting in 12-hour days longer. But there really needs to be a change in mentality for that. And that trickles down to some of our service providers too. Some of those dedicated cleaners who just are always there and have been there, through good times and bad. It's just, if you're not feeling well, if somebody in your home is not feeling well, it is not in our best interest to have you come to work. Really, it's not. You'll see signage in regards to elevator ridership. You'll see floor decals in regards to 6 feet separation, 6-foot separation. A lot of the essential retailer operations that have always been in place throughout this, be kind of similar to that tactic, trying to visually provide a safer environment and to communicate to that people. And you'll see thank you signage. You'll see you'll see signage most likely in regards to thanking people for working safely, thanking people for adhering to the policies and procedures. And then you'll see a need to phase. You'll see communication plans in regards to phasing. Because one thing people are going to want to do is going to need to roll with the punches, both good and bad, if the situation should change. So every policy and every signage and every email communication should be tailored to the fact that these are all subject to change as we hopefully change to the positive into the future. There's a big focus right now too on hands-free improvements. A lot of the newer buildings have a lot of these features that are already in place, but now the true emphasis on a lot of, Class B buildings and buildings that are a little bit older that have never really gone to hands-free devices and restrooms, most notably for soap dispensers, for towel dispensers, for egress to and from the restroom itself. There's some technology in regards to, they're called step-in pulls that you can step on and pull the door open with your foot. There are technology there. So a look towards technology is, and I think there's going to be more opportunities for that in the future as a result of this. Just, disinfecting elevator buttons are being placed in certain elevators. There are ones for handles that are being placed on revolving doors and entranceways. So there'll be a huge emphasis on exploring technology, and I think we'll see a lot more landlords implement such technology as a result of this, who are apprehensive in the past due to the cost impact of it. You'll see shields and up at lobby desks, concierge desks, and you'll see people just need to provide visual identification access to get into the building rather than provide it. You won't see any hand-to-hand exchanges of those things for the near future. In regards to access controls, there's always been an apprehension with some of the office towers and utilizing emergency stairwells for egress to and from the building as a security concern, as a fire life safety concern. You'll see some landlords, especially in the urban towers, offer that opportunity, putting card access readers on doors that might not normally have had doors. but yet still being able to provide tracking data. One thing that we've found out over the past 2 months is there has been a reliance upon using card access systems to provide information on who was actually working on a given date when there is a confirmed infected person that's been identified by a tenant or by a service provider or building personnel. So such data is good to be maintaining. There are some suburban tenants that have started to look into and investigate QIR software that some have in place as a voluntary basis to track people who have come in and out of buildings that don't normally have security for that same purposes of being able to identify that there was an individual who was working also on Tuesday, and this person who also works on the 7th floor was in here, and he or she has been designated, so they can take their own measures in place. There's a big emphasis, and I know that Paul will present on this later on protecting that information. So a lot of the data that is just extremely generic as to who those individuals are, of course. Climate control, as Emily discussed earlier, landlords are taking a look at whether or not they're going to be interested in offering their tenancy extended hours, extending the business day to go further into the evening as part of the HVAC normal business hour operations. Most buildings, including a lot of urban buildings, are doing their full spring filtration change out, basically cycling out all of their quarterly filters within tenant spaces and within the within the penthouses and mechanical rooms of the building to have a kind of in a ways to seize the day of low to no occupancy for some tenants to really be able to get into their spaces and be able to change out those filters to kind of go in on day one with a fresh set of protection in place. And, a lot of landlords are also looking at, increasing the MERV rate on their filters that they have for these outside air intakes for their floor boxes themselves. There are limitations on some features because of their design, but where and if possible, you'll see buildings upping their MERV rate basically if they possibly can. And also looking at other options, most notably things that are not really necessarily as vetted out yet, such as UV lighting and ductwork and its negative impact on airflow and/or ionization filters, which are extremely expensive. And there's some degree of pessimism as to their true abilities, I guess. But you'll see an emphasis on that. And then touchless thermostats. As we go to more touchless environments. So enhanced cleaning practices. Most buildings, rolled out key touch point items in the lobbies, elevators, restrooms, doorways, et cetera, around the property. Really when this situation started to reveal itself, and those practices most definitely can and should be still being implemented at this time, and you will see those practices in place. You may see an additional day porters, depending on the type of building. Than have been in the past. You might see additional day cleaning as you'll see managers and landlords potentially moving more evening staff into day staff to help provide more daily cleaning, especially if occupancy is so limited that the amount of evening cleaners aren't necessarily as essential as the amount of day cleaners in place for while people are actively working. And there may be some tenant considerations that need to be made as such because of that. A lot of tenants in the past have been resistant to day cleaning because of its impact on their business, having cleaners working in their space during the business day. Tenant enhanced cleaning, your managers should be able to provide you through their contractor customized cleaning plans. If tenants wish to explore doing additional work, specific to their space. In regards to kitchenettes, conference rooms, common areas, dedicated work areas, et cetera, similar to additional carpet cleaning, additional glass cleaning, depending on a given tenant space, how they wish to have. So managers and their contractors should be easily able to provide that scope of work and pricing for that. And then there's going to be most likely requirements in regards to best practices when noticed of disinfecting. The notice provision for communication is still, I believe, an essential piece of this equation, that tenants notify their management company if they have experienced an infected individual within their space, just so people can take the necessary precautions and to do the necessary additional cleaning, which typically consists of additional disinfecting with EPA certified products that are on the CDC's website, and an electrostatic cleaning spraying, which has been very common when we have experienced infected personnel over the last 2 months as a pretty quick and not that expensive way to disinfect the space. And then the last option being fogging, which I know some tenants have entertained, and I would just urge tenants to fully vet that out ahead of time and make sure that they understand the impact of a fogging process on their space, as it has impacts on on documentation that might be laying around, on artwork that needs to be protected and stuff of that nature. When you think of fogging is similar to like a pest control situation of like really kind of bombing the space. So you want to have necessary precautions taken before exploring that option. On the tenancy side or / employment side, a lot of talk about temperature checks and health and welfare checks, and that will be most likely, if you look towards other states, a critical component of reentry. In that the employer is going to be most likely responsible for administrating such requirements. We've seen that pretty much across the state, across the country, and it's been it's a large topic of conversation. But you're most likely going to see that the employer is going to need to be responsible for its own personnel and or its own contractors and vendors and visitors it wishes to utilize. And most likely, with the exception of maybe some large, single tenant or major tenant operators, be done within the tenant premises or prior to occupancy. That there'll be, again, a huge emphasis on PPE at work, employee cleanliness, keeping their workstations clean, and an urge to people to please limit deliveries and limit the amount of visitors to again increase the social distancing aspect of managing during this crisis. And Emily kind of spoke earlier about a lot of the floor plate related concerns that tenants should be taken into consideration for social distancing and for employee traveling even within their own floor plate, whether it's directional travel, limiting certain access to certain areas, et cetera. So a final slide on some other bulleted items. I think you're going to see fitness centers that still remain closed. See what the governor has to say about that. I think where you see fitness centers being even voluntarily provided, you'll probably still see them closed until we get further down in this phasing. Other than that, you may see restrictions if you have gyms that are required in tenants' leases. You may see social distancing best practices, PPE, certain equipment may need to be moved to be more spaced apart. So it might be limited in available resources, but it's still open. You may see towel services that would have existed, been canceled, stuff of that nature. You'll see signage regarding limited access recommendations for elevators. There's a lot of talk about elevator quadrants. I think it's a great idea for a visual communication piece to help emphasize that. So I think you'll see, again, flexible planning, flexible communication, but it's a good visual for people to see too. And so I believe you'll see a lot of landlords looking to help promote that. Confined spaces, mail rooms, bike rooms, you'll see policies in replace. So 1-by-1 entrance, because such spaces are limited in their size. So again, a lot of this is trying to just make sure people don't overcrowd each other. And so confined spaces will need to be addressed for signage, or address lobby shields. Retailers, such as food service providers, some may remain closed because it just doesn't work with their businesses if they're allowed to. You'll see a lot of prepackaged food being provided. You may see some retail operators for lobby be web-based ordering only or app-based web-based only to limit queuing of lines and stuff like that in the common areas of lobby. And again, I think state and local mandates will rule the day. People will have to continue to stay abreast of policies and changes and procedures and recommendations, and more importantly, mandates that might be placed upon us, and the need to be flexible during this period to be able to, again, pivot on a dime to change as these things present themselves. And then lastly, I think, in the commercial real estate services industry, I think through the Building Owners and Managers Association, we continue to preach and to remind people that we are in a service-based industry. And so, we're looking to work with our tenants, work with our clients, our landlords, our third-party service providers to find solutions to problems, you know, with an aspect of trying to be reasonable, because you know, you can't do everything, and you're not necessarily going to make everyone happy, especially in a multi-tenant environment. But a service mindset is still key during this whole equation to make sure we're out to make the situation as safe and as best as possible, so that people have confidence and comfort to return to work.
Thank you, Sean. That was terrific and covered a lot of ground. And so now we're going to shift a little bit to Paul Bauer from Bowditch to really give us some legal perspective on all of this, both from employer perspective, land property owner perspective as well. So Paul, the screen is yours. Happy to forward these along, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks to MassEcon for putting this together. My strategy to get through this in 10 minutes is to talk really fast, and hopefully we can get more detail on the questions, and also you can feel free to click through to our website. There's a link for more COVID resources there. What I'm finding and hearing is that the challenge of reopening, from what I'm hearing from clients, what I've heard today, and what I know we're going through just for our firm, the challenge of reopening is exceeding going remote, right? It's just there isn't a body of law to follow. The guidance is changing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and we're all trying to figure out a way. And I think that Emily and Sean give a good presentation on just sort of all these issues and all the things that are that people are thinking about to try to get open in as safe a manner as possible. So I'm going to try not to be redundant and to focus on sort of the legal issues that arise from some of these things, but there will be some overlap, I think, on the operational side. On safety issues, how do you operate in a safe manner? The whole idea, and Sean touched on the screening employees, if it is a required obligation, we will obviously, people are going to have to comply with it. The CDC guidance right now is that it's an optional strategy, and given temperature checks and how effective they are to really measure whether somebody's infectious, it's going to be a real question, I think, for employers and landlords to work through, because of there's a whole process with social distancing and taking doing the screen PPE for the screener, training, record keeping. There's a lot of privacy issues if they identify that this is a medical, basically a medical exam that you're requiring occupants or visitors to the space to go through. So if you're gonna have to make sure that you don't disclose any of their medical information. So in some settings it may be essential. In other settings, we may find that better approach is employee visitor education, maybe self-certification, depending on the circumstances. What if employees don't want to come back on some time frame? I think Emily touched on this, and working with from a legal standpoint, ultimately, if the employer is complying with law, guidance, etc., they can technically require employees to come back to work. But so it's not a legal issue, but there is a morale issue involved here, right? And so I think that you're going to hear a lot from me today, and I think you heard it from the previous presenters as well, that collaborating, discussing with the employee what are the issues they have, can they be addressed, can they work remotely for a period of time, how would this all work out? And I think that's probably the best advice, and it's going to be advice that we hear throughout, which is not necessarily legal advice, but there's no 100-year body of pandemic law. What if some employees won't comply with safety requirements? So this seems like an easy one, right? So you say, okay, if they don't comply, then they have to go home. But you get into some more nuances. What if senior staff doesn't comply, and you're asking administrative teams to comply? And I think that creates both a morale issue and potentially a liability issue down the road. Same with, and it could be really tricky, right? With customers, clients, vendors that are entering your space, and how do you make sure that they comply with your whatever your protocols that you've put in place. What does an employer tell its employees if an employee tests positive for COVID? Per the CDC, if an employee is confirmed to have COVID-19, employers should inform fellow employees of the possible exposure, but maintain confidentiality as required by the Americans with Disability Act. So we'll see what guidance we get from the state when they come out with any reopening plans. But right now you've got to walk a fine line. And I think that's going to apply for landlords as well. And I think that's going to be sort of a common sense thing. If someone in the building, if the landlord becomes aware that somebody in the building tested positive, do you inform, depending on the building, you might inform all tenants on that floor. Other buildings, it might be that you inform all tenants in the building. Next slide. Common areas and amenities, and we had a lot of discussion, and Sean went through it in some detail, and I don't want to belabor it, but landlords are focusing on a lot of these sort of required common areas, things like elevators and restrooms, and trying to figure out ways to make them as safe as possible. More amenity-based common areas, I think we're going to find are stopped from use, discontinued for a while. And there will be a lease issue on that. A lot of leases provide full discretion to the landlord to keep those amenities running or close them, but other leases, you may have tenants saying, hey, look, that was part of, that was baked into our rent. And if we're not going to have those amenities for a long period of time, we should have a discussion over what that means. Does the landlord have any responsibility beyond the common areas? So I don't think landlords are going to want to get anywhere near deep cleaning, disinfecting of individual tenants' spaces, but they will be responsible for common areas. And I think, as Sean alluded to, we're going to have some discussion about sort of the standard cleaning and whether that's going to be elevated, and whether there's going to be sort of further work done to disinfect doorknobs and countertops and everything on, say, a daily or weekly basis. Lease issues are relevant there too, because on a triple net lease, all those expenses will get passed through to the tenants. And on an escalator lease, these will be passed through to the extent they raise the operating costs. We saw this with 9/11, that landlords running buildings increase the security to counter any terrorism threats with more personnel, more cameras, more work with the parking garage, things like that. And then there were a lot of discussions between landlords and tenants as to what costs should be passed along. Should those be sort of imputed into a previous base year, as opposed to, say, a new expense that there's nothing to sort of set it off on the base year for tenants. So I think those are issues that we're not going to see right away, but we will probably see in calendar year 2021 when reconciliations occur. Can landlords, there's a couple of questions here. I think it's, yeah. So can landlord require tenants to provide proof of employees being tested, temperature checked? I think landlords, this will remain to be seen, but I think that they're going to try to put most of the operational questions on the employer, on the tenants, employers, require compliance with law, guidance, etc. I think we're going to see some, I think a big point, and I think both Emily and Sean made this point, but we're going to see a lot of collaboration. That really is the only way this is going to work between landlords and tenants. And I think that becomes sort of a key point, because landlords and tenants are going to have to figure out, how do people flow in and out of the building? How do they flow in and out of the premises in a way that minimizes the inability to socially distance, right? So will one door be for entrance and another door solely for exiting the building? Things like that. Can you do that with the premises? Do you have to reconfigure your security for things like that? So I think all those things are operational issues, which Sean and Emily spoke to, but I think that they're really going to be part of the guidance for how we go forward. I think another issue that you're going to see is what happens if tenants, if employees of tenants are congregating in common areas and the landlord becomes aware of it, and they're going to, landlord might tell them, you know, you need to disperse, etc. But you know, how often do you do that before you send a notice to the tenant? Is it ever going to get to the level of sort of a legal notice or not? That type of thing. One advice that we have from landlords is that they, you can't unilaterally modify leases, but almost all leases provide that the landlord can have rules and regulations and can amend those rules and regulations from time to time. And we think that we will see landlords, and we're working with landlords to put together supplemental rules and regulations that can govern kind of, you know, COVID-19 era. I am going to, there are compliance, and I don't want to go into a lot of it, but there is CDC and EEOC guidance. There is, look for the state guidance when it comes out. Best practices, BOMA has some out, and there will be more out from other trade organizations. And I think this was alluded to earlier, but I think that this is, a lot of this doesn't get as granular as you're going to have to get. It gives you sort of a general framework for what you need to do, but really what happens with this is that folks are going to have to like really drill down and start to really evaluate all the operational points within their building and their space. And I think Sean did a good job of going through some of the details on that we've got to deal with. Now I'd like to turn to liability issues. So what if somebody tests positive? And they bring an action against either a landlord or a tenant. Plaintiffs will have a hard time proving causation. They could have been contracted anywhere. It may not happen in the space. Of course, if there's a cluster, there's a greater risk. And we're seeing that with the Walmart stores. And it's sort of the cautionary tale. And I think it's a caution for everyone as they go back into you know, commencing operations. And this gets to, I think, the bigger issue. Emily had this slide at the beginning that showed that, you know, the virus, we're going to reopen with the virus still here. It hasn't gone away. And we're doing our best to minimize the potential that people contract COVID-19. But it's not, under no scenario is this saying that no one's going to get it, right? So landlords and tenants can comply with all the existing laws, follow the guidance, put into place a lot of procedures. And what that's doing is minimizing risk, but it's not eliminating it. There's still going to be some exposure to liability here. And that's why I think when people open, they're going to have to open in a very cautious manner, take as many precautions as they can. For landlords, I think who knows how the body of law will go. I mean, the only way to really stop some of that risk is to say we're going to open and have the law provide a statutory protection against liability. And I know that's been proposed at the federal level in different forms and at the state level as well. But it's not there yet, so except for certain industries, but for the most part, there is some exposure here. So from the landlord's perspective, right now it would look to be kind of a negligence standard. Was the landlord's negligence responsible for the person getting sick? Well, again, we'll have those causation issues. For operating companies, for their employees, there are worker comp issues and claims that could come out of that. for visitors and the like, there's sort of the same negligence standard, but maybe a deeper relationship, a deeper responsibility. Leases between landlord and tenant will often set out some contractual indemnification in them that I think are worth looking at to understand what the exposure is. Insurance issues that will that could come about. So as of today, and this is going to be a big caveat, as of today, there are some virus exclusions in CGL policies for the first party, but generally not for third party claims. So you got to review your policy, but for the most part, these claims should be covered or at least defended by an insurer under reservation. Should companies inquire regarding their policies with their insurers? Yes. You should review your policies with your risk management or your agent to figure out what your coverage is, what your exclusions are, whether you need to upgrade your policies to include, say, E&O coverage for claims that from shareholders or others. A lot of insurance does not cover contractual indemnities, so you want to make sure that you have a rider that provides that protection as well. And then I will add that because this is not a completely retrospective event, we're not figuring out what happened when something blew up, a month ago. We're looking at something that could have happened last month, can keep happening into the future, right? So as your policies renew, you're going to have to negotiate and look at what the policies cover. And just this morning, I got a proposed renewal that includes the following exclusion: communicable disease. Insurance provided under this policy does not apply to communicable disease arising out of the actual or alleged transmission of a communicable disease. This exclusion applies even if the claims against any insured allege negligence or other wrongdoing in the supervising, hiring, employing, training, or monitoring of others, testing for communicable disease, failure to prevent the spread, or failure to report the disease to authorities. So we know where we know where the insurance is going to go, but that doesn't mean that there won't be insurance that specifically covers it, perhaps. But you may have to negotiate it, and my guess is that those policies are going to include some specific premiums for riders to that effect. So to summarize, look, there is risk in opening. It can be mitigated by following all the applicable guidance, working with folks like you heard in the first two presentations to talk about ways that you can structure your space and think about it and make it as safe as possible, and that will mitigate some of the risk. But and applying common sense and collaborating with the other stakeholders involved. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Pete.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to all our panelists. Given the rich and desired information that we're looking for here, we went a little bit long on the presentations, but we're going to allow for as much time as we can for questions going forward. So again, a little bit of a review of the guide. For those of you who are interested in asking a question, raise your hand. Our co-moderator, Annie O'Connell, will come on now and begin introducing those who have their hands raised for questions, and our panelists. I will assign a panelist to respond as I see appropriate. So with that, let's turn it over to Annie O'Connell for our first question.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So we have a question from Doug Kellum, who is a senior director at MassEcon.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Sean, I was listening to what you said about the spaces having thermal cameras to check body temperatures. I read an article from May 5th in the Wall Street Journal. The title was, "Welcome back to the office. Your every move will be watched." And I was thinking about that. And when we get into that process, I guess in larger spaces, who's going to monitor? Has there been anything mentioned out there? Who will monitor all that information when you get into thermal cameras and mobile apps to monitor distancing, would it be facility people, or would there be medical staff or health professionals on site to monitor all that information? It seems like it's going to be heavy health and medical information that'll need to be interpreted.
Well, it's directed towards Sean, and Sean, feel free to weigh in.
Sure, and maybe Paul has something to follow up on the legal side of that. But on the landlord side, I have not been heard of anyone, with the exception of federal and state buildings, that on the landlord side that is going to be doing any thermal scanning or any health and welfare checks unless mandated to do so. And then there are certain liability, issues that are waived. As a byproduct of doing so. So that's obviously an extremely important item, because you cannot have like uneducated individuals performing this type of work, whether it be, traditional security concierge officers or what have you. Then there's the data collection in and of itself. So the only area that I've seen that is really on the landlord side is like federal buildings and stuff of that nature who have implemented, advanced healthcare screening, such as thermal scanning and stuff of that nature. Other than that, in my opinion, of course, it's going to be if the employer's decision if they wish to implement such practices upon their personnel, and the employer will need to deal with the security and healthcare information of those individuals.
Yeah, so just to add, so the EEOC, which is, implements the Americans with Disability Act, it's and I'm not an employment lawyer, but it is prohibited to require medical examinations for employees generally, and there are a bunch of exclusions, and one of the exclusions really covers this, right? So it is possible to do it. But you then need to comply with all the kind of privacy requirements of the ADA and HIPAA and everything else. So I think that there are privacy protections in place. But to Doug's point, you could have this body of data that's sitting out there, and that is people will want to be cautious with it.
Okay. Back to Annie for a second question.
Sure. So I actually don't have any questions coming in at the moment, but they may trickle in. But Sean, you may be able to best answer this question. Do you anticipate seeing any commercial real estate trends from moving from the city to the suburbs? Because I feel like for city employers, a big draw is access to public transportation. And I think there will be less of a demand or less of an interest in taking public transportation to work, and people may want bigger spaces as well and be more spread out within their own offices. So do you anticipate seeing any sort of trends moving from the city to the suburbs, or any other trends that you might anticipate based on what's happened over the last couple months and will continue for a while to come?
Ooh, Annie, that is a good question. Are you trying to get me fired? Is this being recorded? So with somebody with the city of Boston properties primarily, I would say very interesting question, Annie, and that, the city of Boston, most notably the seaport, to which I've predominantly been at over the last decade, has really had like a flight to quality of suburban operators who have moved into the seaport to be locally to be more attractive to younger populations of aspiring professionals for more easily access to the MBTA system and stuff of that nature. There could be a sort of a return to the suburbs and a revitalization of the suburban market for options to limit people's need to utilize those services by being able to provide more parking, more area. I'll second again Emily's proposal, Emily's presentation earlier. you know, that there's definitely the need, you know, they were, people for the last, I don't know, 5 years or so have been shrinking up the square footage per person from, you know, 250 to 75 and benching people. And I have a sister building in the Seaport that was really being built kind of predominantly on that basis. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, whether they now need to take additional floor plates because they've already committed to the building. They now need to expand their premises. They can't have people on top of each other. And, you know, whether this will lead to positive aspects of more growth for the commercial real estate, will now need more space to spread people out, or is the unveiling of a rather successful work from home component of the last 2 months offer opportunities to offer more flexible working. So, you know, I no longer have a lot of suburban properties, but I can envision it that this could be, you know, and Massachusetts is already really was fundamentally stronger than ever 2 months ago.
Yeah.
You know, and there could be a flight to the burbs as a result of this, and, you know, for secondary locations too.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Back to Annie. Any questions? I remind the attendees that we do have the chat room available as well, where you can offer a question as well. But I know we have, it looks like we have a couple hands raised at this point. Annie?
Yep, I'm just going to, let's see. So we have Nick Korn who has a question. So Nick, if you're ready to ask your question of the panelists, you can go ahead now.
Sure. I think you guys did a pretty good job of covering a start of the complications regarding like temperature checks. But in terms of requiring other steps for employees returning and or guests coming into the space. So I'm curious to hear about like requiring either retraining or certification or sort of handbook additions prior to employees returning to work regarding new procedures. And then also, can you require the same and even up to a waiver of liability for guests or non-employees coming in?
But let's start with Emily there, and then maybe work in Paul and Sean as well. Emily, do you want to start?
Sure, and I just want to make sure that I heard that complete question. Could you just repeat that one last part in terms of updating guidelines you had mentioned? Sorry,
yeah, just requiring like a retraining or like signing a handbook edition for employees before returning to work.
Yeah.
And secondarily, like a waiver of liability if there's non-employees coming into the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about that. And certainly in terms of any of the guidelines and the policies, this is going to be important to create these updates and message that out to employees and to ensure that employees are aware of what these updated guidelines are. We don't know, you know, all of us know this, we don't know when they're going to start and then end. It's just an evolving process, but I definitely believe that, you know, it's going to be important that we all know, right, for our own sort of social accountability to one another. What I do and how I behave and how I move about the office is going to impact, you know, you and vice versa. So I think the guidelines are going to need to be absolutely updated. And I think, you know, does sort of kind of move into the legal question, Paul, in terms of signing that and having employees, you know, assure employers that they are aware and that they are complying with some of the guidelines that are being set forth, because it's not just about an individual employee, it's really about the collective, right? We're talking about the entire workforce and coming back in.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a bad idea to, you know, have, clearly I think training makes a lot of sense for employees. I think that if you're doing supplements to your manual, you might well want to have the employees sign off that they've read it, that they understand it. I think waivers for employees, and I assume we're talking about waiver of liability if they were to get infected as to employees, I think that would be tricky. I'm not sure how much effect it would have. Workers' comp should be covering them in any event. And I think it might be of greater value for visitors to your space. But I wouldn't use that as a guarantee that if someone were to conclude, if a jury were to conclude that you were negligent in failing to do something, that you had some exposure irrespective of that waiver. I'm not sure that would be a hard bar, particularly not for employees, but may well apply to at least some categories of visitors to the extent, you know, if they're a vendor, for example, you know, and it's sort of a condition to getting the work, and it's not really the vendor, then it's an actual employee of the vendor. It's tricky. I'm not sure how much we can rely on the waivers to get us out of it.
Right. Thanks, Paul. I just want to add one other thing too in terms of training, because we are thinking a lot about, you know, this hybrid team effect, right? There's going to be so many more hybrid teams, and how do we, you know, support our remote workforce through training, but it really extends to the employees who are coming back in the office. And I do think that in addition to any of the guidelines that are created and that is spread about the office, and whatever employees may or may not have to do in terms of signing that to before they step back in, any kind of updating training materials ahead of time could actually be worthwhile and useful, whether that's video training, you know, what we can do to really equip employees with the ability to understand what's expected of them and of others, increases that, I think, the confidence of feeling safe to come back into the office. And again, back to that issue of a risk threshold, and how do we begin to look at that and help that for employees to feel confident going forward.
Any other questions? I actually have one myself, but Annie, want to ask if you have any queued up?
Sure. So we have a question that was submitted for me to ask from Tegan Gata at Mass Econ, and her question is for the panel. And she's wondering if there have been any conversations regarding the transition from summer to fall and any cold weather practices that we should be preparing for.
Let's give that one to Emily as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, and I think we all can kind of weigh in on this. If you think about it, right, so there's that idea, do we have to be, and how can we be prepared for any cycle of infectious outbreak that may occur? And what I mentioned earlier, what we all know, some of the data is saying we could expect that to happen. We don't know exactly, right? It could happen at any time, but we expect it could happen in the fall. And what does that mean? How do we prepare for that? If you think about the fact that we're phasing back into offices as we believe to be during weather that's nicer, right? Those of us who live here in Massachusetts are well equipped for the kind of coats that we need to wear in, you know, colder weather, but we've been talking about that in terms of what does that mean and what is that impact going to be in terms of where employees are going to store their coats, right? And what kind of one next to the other. How do we begin to look at that a little bit differently also and rethink the operations around, you know, what people wear when they come into the office during colder weather months. I think, you know, to be honest, like all of us, we're all just really focused on in the moment, you know, how do we even begin to digest everything that we need to digest to get ready to go into phase one of moving into offices again, right? So there's just many, many things ahead of us that it's hard to sometimes think beyond that. But again, we don't know quite what will happen in terms of therapeutics. We hope for the best, right, around that, and hope for the best as well as we move further into this year and next for vaccination being potentially widespread and more available that might mitigate some of these challenges that we know are going to come up in moving from summer to fall. But these are very things that are top of mind for us, Perkins and Will, and how we think about this for our studios globally, as well as for what we're helping our clients with. Anyone else, Sean or Paul, thoughts on that?
I'll just be brief in that I think on the landlord property management side, you know, you're going to not see the, you know, any relaxation of any best practices, you know, not taking the foot off the pedal when we go through this into the summertime if things start to get better in lieu of the potential reemergence of the virus in the fall. So I think it's going to be important upon, you know, landlords and property management personnel and their providers to continue to stockpile resources to make sure that they're kept on hand. And those lessons learned and preparations that or activities that we have been undertaking over the last couple of weeks will still need to be at hand. I'll make a humorous remark that I don't believe our task force at BOMA will sunset anytime too soon, as I know there was a 180 done on that yesterday down in Washington, D.C. So, task force and people still making, having open forums of discussions to plan, to prepare for, will continue on throughout the calendar year in preparation for the fall. Fall, like the spring, offers the opportunity with people who have plate and frame heat exchangers, economizers, to utilize those services to limit the amount of mechanical cooling, which helps in the use of outside air intake. So the great opportunities with the fall season that could reemerge itself, much like the spring right now, that aren't necessarily as available due to mechanical cooling in the summertime due to the heat. I think that's just going to be the emphasis on the commercial landlord side this is going to be an issue to deal with through the calendar year, and we should plan on that as being such.
Yeah, I agree, and I was just going to add, maybe it's not so much a legal comment, but I think it's a great question, because I think on the retail side that we're going to see retailers using the outdoor space as much as possible, and so I think that you're going to have landlords and tenants working together, and I hope that municipalities will be accommodating to help get some of the activities that normally are done in the store outside, whether it's dining, or I know at least one retailer that's going to take orders when they reopen. They're going to take orders outside and fulfill the orders outside, so you won't come into the store, you're going to come to the front door of the store. And I think that that's kind of kicking the can down the road, right, and gets us all through the summer maybe, and we'll figure it out. So, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see barber or hairstylist chairs set up outside and things like that, just to minimize sort of risk.
I think there's also, that's a really good point, Paul, and then, what do we need to think about when we return to campuses, right? Just as we're talking about here, returning to workplace, what's going to be like back in the city, if and when and how students are going to be returning to campuses, and what we need to think about that as we move from spring to summer to fall.
Back to Annie. Any other questions queued up?
We do not have any more questions, so feel free to ask your question.
Let me, so we have, we'll look at noon as a wrap for this discussion. And again, I want to thank the panelists and all the attendees for extending your time with us this morning. So it's somewhat of a summary here. There are a lot of best practices out there, and we heard a lot about what might be coming down. Would recommendations be right now from our different panels in terms of what employers should be considering right now, what property owners, managers should be considering right now, the planning that they should be doing right now in anticipation of a reopen. May 18th is on the horizon. We don't know what will actually be coming from the state at that time. So now is the time to plan. Now is the time to start acting upon some of these best practices and recommendations and so forth. My final question is: there's recommended, and then there's required. At some point, there are going to be actions that employers and property owners, tenants will have to take, because it is required of them. Whatever comes down the pike, so to speak, from the state or the federal government. So we know that those things will be required. You have to do them. Then there's the whole range of recommended. And I guess my question is, at what point, and maybe we'll start with Paul here, at what point can an employer or a property owner feel comfortable with recommended practices doing the required, but also doing recommended. And when there's a sea of recommended, perhaps beyond what they're putting in place. And so there's a lot of recommended. You adapt as part of your plan a certain amount of those recommended practices, best practices, but there are other things that you might not include. To what extent are, given again what will be something of a sea of different recommendations out there, you're putting in place certain recommendations, but perhaps not all. What becomes your exposure as an employer, as a property owner, and so forth, should, again, somebody get sick?
Right. So it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? I mean, at some point, if you look at it in the recommendation, the guidance, you certainly want to comply with as much guidance as you can, but there may be times where physical space doesn't permit it. It doesn't, or the cost involved would mean you couldn't operate, right? And you're going to have to make a judgment at that point. I mean, that's not really a helpful legal analysis. It's just where we're at. I mean, without sort of, again, and I mentioned before, but without some limitation on liability that says if you do this, you're not going to be liable if somebody gets sick in your space. Without that, it's all, and I don't mean to scare people. It's employees will have workers' comp. There's things that are out there, but there inherently is some risk in reopening. And if you do every piece of guidance and you follow every legal requirement, that will mitigate the risk, but it won't eliminate it.
So I want to give everybody a 20-second opportunity for parting thoughts to our audience as we conclude. So let's start with Emily.
Oh, thank you so much, Pete. And thank you to Mass Econ for hosting this webinar. I think, all of us are really thinking about a lot of these questions, not having all of the answers readily available. We are all in the same boat. So I think that underscores a lot of where we're at right now, to the points that Paul is making and Sean as well. We have the information we have to make our best decisions in the moment that we're in, right? I sort of live by that philosophy, and yet at the same time, I'm a strategist, right? So how do you really plan for the future, knowing that we have only a limited amount of information and it's evolving daily? So I think that one of the ways that employers can really stay on top of this is participating in conversations like this, having a set of leaders in their organization to be looking at this very carefully on a daily basis in terms of, as I was mentioning, as we move into the transition phase and beyond, and that we're going to learn as we go along. So we're going to have to learn how to tack with the wind, to pivot as we have new information that comes out, and as we have to react to new information. So I think part of that is just really being able to go with what's coming at us and understanding we're finding this out, we're figuring this out all together. I know we've been using all of this, we're all in this together. We are. We're in this unprecedented time. We are. This hasn't happened in over 100 years. And just to have the faith that we're going to move through this time. I know that we are. I feel like we are. It may be a complicated set of issues. It may be hard to do, but we're going to kind of land in another place and begin to continue to have the conversations about how, when, and where we work, and how do we optimize that. So I think that's just some of my thoughts in closing.
So Emily went over 20 seconds, but she had the most
Sorry.
brief presentation. So you got that added time. So Sean, I'm going to hold you to that 20 seconds.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Mass Econ, and thank you to Emily and Paul for their collaboration for this presentation. It's been a great experience over the last hour and a half to listen to everyone. I think just signing off that there's going to need to be a continued emphasis on personal responsibility. Much like to your question a second ago, Peter, there's the the wearing of personal protective equipment and the essential aspect of that from the onset, it'll be interesting to see how, when that evolves from a mandate to a recommendation, how much compliance is taken. Because I know from working in the city usually two or three days a week, that people are not accustomed to wearing that stuff. So there's a resistance to it. And, you know, so where that continues to evolve once sort of the light is green, that people are not required to, I'll be interested to see how that dynamic changed, because I you know, on my loose estimates, I would put that 75% of people don't like wearing that, or uncomfortable wearing that. So they will resist it when they can. So, you know, so personal accountability will be a key function of this return to work and the success of it, so that people are protecting themselves. And thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And Paul?
Thank you, Pete. And again, thanks to MassEcon and Emily and Sean, Annie, for putting this together. I agree with every point that was made, so I don't want to reiterate them. I do think that 2 points, I guess. One is that it's not a point in time. And I think this is to Emily's point as well. This is going to be just continually evolving, and people are going to have to keep it. It's not like you can get the space ready. You can say, well, okay, we're reopened, we're done, yay. It's going to require that we continue to kind of keep thinking about it, evolving, moving, following the information, the data that comes out. The second thing is, I think that it's just mission critical that that there be communication among all stakeholders. Landlords, tenants, employees, vendors, clients, customers, everybody that's going to be interacting with this space, right? Or with your business. You need to really have communication, work through, say, here's what we got, and work forward with that sort of collaborative process, because I don't see how we can get through it otherwise.
Well, thank you all again, Emily, Sean, and Paul. On the screen right now are some additional resources you may want to check out. A reminder to everybody who is online as an attendee, you can go to our website later today and you'll be able to see this presentation. You will want to go to massecon.com and go to the COVID Resource Center, and this presentation will be featured there along with these links. So as this slide suggests. And stay tuned for an upcoming survey where we'll be surveying those on who are attending here today, as well as the rest of the MassEcon membership about readiness to reopen and input there that we would like to provide our friends in state government as they make their considerations in terms of reopening. So finally, again, thank you, Emily, thank you, Sean, thank you, Paul, thank you, Annie O'Connell, our co-moderator, and thank you, attendees, for your participation. Greatly appreciated. Stay tuned for additional programming coming down the road from MassEcon. I hope you all have a healthy day today and week, and we look forward to seeing you physically at some point, hopefully in the near future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.